So guys, I'm doing a video series called Ghetto Experience Trauma, where, as me who's part African American, I talk about like experiences that I've had around thugs and hood type of black people and how that's kind of
Mhm.
impacted my life. And I do want to mention too that, as a disclaimer, I've been bullied and treated poorly by people of different races. Like when I was in college, I had a bunch of Jewish professors call me a nigger. When I did the 4 year film project, I've had many people say things like, oh, well, you're a black guy. Is that blacks work with blacks? And also just mean experiences by many white people. And I also remember when I was in middle school, I had a bunch of fake Asian friends really who would take advantage of me. So there's bad behavior in every group really. But I think that what a lot of people are doing nowadays is they're calling out black fatigue and ghetto fatigue. And I think it's important to make videos to talk about experiences and how when and how some people have self hate or feeling towards their own race because of bad experiences and trauma. Really, we should always just treat each other with niceness and respect. So, I remember like in middle school, I was going from fifth grade into sixth grade, and my parents forced me to go to summer camp. And I've said this before that my parents had the thing called the war on autism. I was misdiagnosed with autism. So that just means that you take a kid who is behind socially, you force them to go to summer camp, you force them to play sports, you force them to get out there and experience life really, when actually they are just better off being alone. There's some kids who just are not, what's the word? They're just not good in social environments, or they get taken advantage of or treated very poorly. But there are people like, no, that's part of your autism. We need to keep forcing this on you. We need to keep forcing social engagement on you because it's going to fight your autism or whatever. Really, it's the same thing as exposure therapy, where if somebody's afraid of something, or like I used to be afraid of roller coasters, like how my dad would intimidate me or pull me by my arm and force me to ride roller coasters to get you out of it. Like it can teach somebody to be a sociopath, or it can help somebody overcome something. I knew this guy who said that he was allergic to strawberries, so his dad would force him to eat strawberries, even though he vomited and was convulsing. His dad was like, that's just drama queen behavior, really. So part of the war on autism is exposure therapy. You are forced to do sports. You are forced to go to summer camp and other things like that. So when I was in middle, this was in New York City. So the first day of summer camp, they had this rule, which was that if you wanted to go to a hot dog cart or anything in New York City, you had to go with somebody else, really. So there was this person who told me to go with him, and then his friends ambushed me and threw like 50, 60 war balloons at me, and they're all like kind of laughing and cheering and stuff. And I felt very like violated because I was kind of like you ruined my clothes and everything like that, and it made me cry as well because I was like a young kid and I was kind of like thrown off about like how mean and how like low people can be really, because it's almost like you know it's almost like like imagine if you went to somebody's prom and you decided to take a cake and throw it on somebody, or take like maybe a fudge fondue and throw it on some girl's like dress really, just to fuck around really. And I grew up in the 90s, the late 90s. So obviously the bully culture, the gang culture was very, 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 very like, popular really. So I remember like how that, that was just like very, very jarring because I was like, I've never met people that disrespectful and that mean really. And I was also saying too, like everybody else was black and dark skinned black, and they kind of had like the hood nigga, the thug stereotype about him. So it kind of fits into, like I said about gang culture and hip hop culture, where it was encouraging, youth to kind of follow that type of bully, being arrogant, being unapologetic, crossing lines type of behavior. I remember another time, and I think like I want to say this because this is like goes off a little bit on a tangent, but I remember like sometimes that there were people who would be throwing war balloons and harassing random people, and I remember like it was weird because they were like throwing war balloons at like this guy, and this guy like screamed like Super Saiyan Goku, and then there was like a strong like thunderstorm, like it was almost like he summoned rain really, and it felt like supernatural almost. So that was kind of weird. Another time in the park that there was this little girl who was like 8 or 9, who was like had to be 6 or 7 years old, and her grandmother was being really stupid, and what she did was stripped her this little girl naked in the park and was washing her. And like I know like that in France and other like countries that's common, but in the 90s in New York, that's weird really. So I remember like there's some people talking about her vagina and other things like that. And it's really messed up really. So it's almost like kids who are 13, 14, 15 years old talking about and making fun of the genitals of a little girl really. And sometimes that comes from that humiliation, that gang culture, that unapologetic culture. I know like another time at summer camp I did with other types of bullying where we would be changing and people would be taking my clothes. So I'll be in my underwear and they'll be like throwing my bag and whatever on the top of the shelves really. Or I remember like how I used to run bullet speed home to my house really, and people thought that I was weird and autistic or goofy, but it was because I was afraid of being jumped by other people going to the camp really. And I remember again, as I said before, and this is kind of like, I don't want to repeat myself too much. This is all like kind of like the ghetto culture of the 90s where some black children are like, okay, well, we see bullying's cool because you watch like, a lot of television, there's lots of bullies, or you look at hip hop culture and there's always the image of a black man or black thug with their friends just harassing and hurting and just being a menace really. I've never seen Friday, but I do believe that there were some movies at that time, encouraging juvenile behavior or encouraging bullying and being mean to others, really, and just being proud of it. Because that kind of goes with the gangster culture and the gangster style, really, of just we're part of being black, part of being a real nigga, part of being like the king of the hood is just to pick on people and bring the worst out in other people. Find easy targets really. I remember, one time I was being bullied so severely that, what's the word? We were swimming in a pool. People were throwing dodgeballs at me. People were pulling me down, trying to pull down my trunks. Really, I remember getting out of the pool and threatening to bring a knife to summer camp, and that's when everything kind of stopped. Really, and people were kind of laughing at how I had an outburst, and I ran away crying. Really, and like I said, I was like in fifth grade, going to sixth grade. That was kind of normal to get emotional when people hurt you. And I remember like being so close to bringing a knife to summer camp. I remember like, that morning, like holding a knife, like being like, I want to do this, to say, hey, stop doing this to me. I actually even thought about killing myself with a knife, really. They checked my bag. And I remember like when they checked my bag, they checked it I remember like the camp counselors, they brought me to the office, they checked my bag. And what happened was that on the top level, there was like a window and a bunch of kids, from the summer camp were like watching what was going on in the meeting, and then they're making fun of me. And I remember how, once again, it was one of those things where the camp counselors did what happens in ghetto and thug culture, which was they kind of held me responsible, and they kind of ignored the bullying that happened really. And I also remember a few other things before I go to the final part, where I remember like I was heckling one of the kids really in Central Park, like while he was playing sports, because I remember watching a Bugs Bunny cartoon where Bugs Bunny was going to like I think a New York Yankees game or Red Sox game where he was heckling the baseball players. So I was imitating this, and this guy threw down the bat and he kind of held me up by my throat. He looked like he was about to punch me, and a few other people jumped in. And it was one of those things too where there were a lot of white people with their like sons and daughters in the park, and a lot of just what's the other thing too really, like mothers with white mothers with their white babies, and they all kind of ran away from us because they're almost like oh my god, all these black people are about to have a nigga moment, like all these black teenagers are about to have a big nigga moment because of the stereotype of what black people do. And this kind of goes down to what you see in a lot of the thug and gangster culture really, of on my side, I was just being a bully like everybody else, really. So I was kind of giving in to that, just downright being nasty thing. And then also this kid who responds with with throwing down a baseball bat and fighting me. That comes down to a couple of things. Like they say, the emotional male in black culture, where you have no sense of no sense of some emotional control. Like, okay, just stop, or just walking down and be like, hey, you know what, you need to stop what you're doing because you know what, you're being an asshole. Instead of just getting to the extreme of fighting an assault, really. And then there's also that gangster culture of oh well, you know what, my first response is to pick a fight with a guy who looks like Steve Urkel. Like my first response is to dominate by with roughness and violence, really. But I also understand what my father told me about middle school people, which is that middle school kids are just assholes. Really, that's kind of like the age group. It's a mix of being a kid and having hormones. It's a mix of being kids and being impulsive. It's a mix of being impressionable and all the other stuff. And I totally get that. But it was definitely something where a lot of these kids were influenced by the ghetto culture. I also remember, I think a few other times in New York City where these kids would be like running the streets, fighting each other in the streets. Some people being kicked out of summer camp or suspended because they'd randomly be roughing housing and punching people in the face and whatever, like punching each other in the face and stuff like that. It was like there was always a fight. There was always people throwing, or like even like when they said we're doing this activity or that activity, it was normal for people to be thrown over like tables and fighting each other and whatever, really, because because of that. And it kind of goes down to what we see in a lot of inner cities, where some people think that that's machismo. Some people think that that makes you a real nigga, that makes you tough, really, or that draws attention to yourself. And that also comes down to what I said about the emotional male, really. And you see that in black experiences. No, in black culture, really, as well, really. When that's an issue in our culture, we need to work on. The same way, like I said, in Asian cultures, it's very misogynistic. Or in white culture, there's an issue of white privilege or spoiled brats or children just, misbehaving and lack of discipline. Like every culture has things to work on, really. But I remember, like, to get to the last part, like when I was like at summer camp, I threatened to bring a knife. They searched my bag. They didn't even punch the kids, really. The camp counselors had to talk with my dad, and they said some things like I was a weird kid. I was possibly special needs because I was doing things like, heckling people, and that only happened one time, but it's ultimately like what we see a lot of, which is, how should I kind of say, where sometimes people are willing to pigeonhole you, but they're not willing to take accountability for everybody else's behavior. And then the other thing too is that, I stole money from my older brother, and I'll be buying a bunch of like foods from vendors and whatever, really, and I lied to my dad about it, and I'll be lying to my brother and everybody that was stealing money from him from his piggy bank, and that was not cool. Fuck me for doing that. And that's also part of that ghetto, Tromby Riley Freeman thing. But I remember like how my dad punished me. I was punished for 3 or 4 days, really, because he was mad that I did not bring the issue to him and ask him how to stand up for myself. And I even wrote like a essay in my college about that experience. And I said the reason why I didn't do that is because my dad was a person that would flip over furniture. He would swear, curse, punch walls, scream, yell, have a bunch of drama, really, because he was always that pent up anger type of person. Like my dad's Italian, so it's almost like he has that white Italian, raging bull, Tony Soprano type of, if I'm having a bad day, I gotta be smashing furniture, I gotta be throwing over things, I gotta be like, bully parenting, I gotta be machismo, I gotta hurt feelings, I gotta dominate by domestic violence and aggression and scaring my children and screaming at them the same way you scream at a dog, really. Like, I felt like a piece of property growing up. I felt like a slave almost because, or like one of those Greek and Roman servant girls, because during the Greek and Roman Empire, they would have like male servants and like male servants that were slaves and girl servants that were slaves, and they would be like, people throw things at them, people throw food at them, it wasn't good, or throw things at them that they served food in the wrong way, like always walking on eggshells and being like, okay, you can't stand up, you have to be a mouse because you have emotionally immature parents. And that's also one of the issues that happens in a lot of communities, and why a lot of people get bullied or other things like that are people like me who has some like social skills and other issues, because you're not raised to teach yourself how to defend yourself. You're not raised to want to socialize because it's always been bad experiences. Because this was all my dad's idea to be like, oh well, I think you have autism, so therefore I'm putting your ass in there so you can learn to socialize with people. Oh well, it's been a bad experience. So you think it's gonna make me want to socialize with other people? But I remember how I felt angry because I was like saying, well, look, all these kids have been doing all these things. They've been starting fights in Central Park. Some of them have been suspended for fighting and roughhousing. They sexually harassed a 7-year-old girl. They've tried to pull down my shorts and my underwear. They try to pull me underwater, try to drown me. They try to do all these things. And no response to that. Byron needs to focus on Byron's behavior. And that's also a bad mentality because that just teaches that just teaches what a lot of strict parents do, which is anybody but my son. My son has to be Rod and Todd Flanders. My son has to be, neat and proper. My son has to turn the other cheek, really. But then you have children who grow up to be antisocial, really. And I remember, like, having a lot of hatred or hating my own skin color because of this ghetto experience trauma, really. But I also will say that obviously, yes, these kids, we were all like middle school age. So obviously, it's understandable that it's obviously very, very like understandable why they would be doing this because that's just what kids do at this age. It doesn't matter the race. When I was in Guilford, Connecticut, there was it was mostly white area, but there was a lot of white kids drinking and driving, playing with fireworks in the woods, smoking weed in the woods, having sex in their houses when their parents were not home. I met like there was East Show teenage pregnancy in my high school. Really, my dad did that typical type of thing of, oh well, you get your girlfriend pregnant, I'll beat your fucking ass, really, type of thing, So, there's issues in all communities, but I will say that it was definitely a bad experience, really, and I understand like how hip hop culture, gangster culture, emotional male culture, machismo culture, and also just the culture of, well, if everybody's mean and ignorant and ghetto, then just do what other people do because that's the way to fit in or that's the way to kind of like move the target from you to somebody else, really. But it did stick with me and it made me very, very angry for a lot of years. And when I moved to Guilford, mostly white community, a few years later, I was like saying, thank God I'm away from all the thugs and the hood niggas and whatever, really, because that was a very painful, traumatic experience. It's unfortunate that happened, really, but it's also very unfortunate because sometimes, as I said, when you're around people who are mean and hurtful and not nice to you, and it's usually from one group, one section, one race, that can make you kind of racist or be like, oh, well, I don't want to be around my own people because when I was around my own people or around people who are similar skin tones to me, it's always been a bad experience, really. So, like niceness can really save a life, really. Meanness can really destroy a life, or it can create 10 times more hate than the hate you inflicted on somebody, or meanness can kill somebody, So always treat people with kindness and respect, please. It's a very powerful thing.